So, um, well, good evening. As you said, my name's Fabian Hamilton, and I'm the Shadow Minister for Peace and Disarmament. And as you rightly said, there's no actual Minister for Peace and Disarmament. Thank you for quoting from my Wikipedia page. I had no hand in writing it whatsoever. But if you'd asked me to talk about cycling, especially building custom carbon-framed racing and road bikes, I probably could have talked to you for an hour and a half about that. That's my hobby. My other hobby is photography, and I just have to apologize for the very poor lighting in this room. I'm currently redecorating my office, which has much better lighting, but I'm not in there, I'm in the sitting room. And behind me, there is the spy cartoon of my esteemed predecessor in the 19th century, the Conservative MP for Leeds North at the time. I have the dubious honour, perhaps, of being the first ever Labour MP for Leeds North East. We won the seat from the Conservatives in 1997, and our majority's gone up and up and up, I'm glad to say. I don't think it's because of anything I'm doing particularly. But thank you very much for asking me to speak to you today, and thank you all for coming. I do recognise one or two faces. I think some of you were at RF Croton when I came down in 2019. At least I believe you were. I'm just looking for some nodding heads there, but I recognise a few faces. It is a real shame that we couldn't be together in person today, but I'm very glad we could go ahead online so I can hear your thoughts and answer some of your questions about Labour's plan for nuclear disarmament. Now, some of you may know, I was appointed Shadow Minister for Peace and Disarmament by Jeremy Corbyn in 2016. It's a post he created. And I was delighted to be asked to continue in my role by Keir Starmer when he was elected as our new party leader in April last year, just over a year ago. Now, Keir called me up on the phone and made clear to me how he regarded peace building and non-proliferation as being a huge part of his long-term vision for the Labour Party and how Britain behaves on the international stage when we're back in government. Now, in Labour's Shadow Foreign Office team, I'm working closely with our relatively new Shadow Foreign Secretary, Lisa Nandy, and I'm leading on all issues relating to arms control and the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. Now, whilst our discussion today is going to focus on this aspect of my role in particular, I'm also responsible for a section of geographical areas where a peace agreement's being implemented, such as Colombia, where trade unionists and peace activists are being targeted by militias every single day, and Cyprus, where Turkish military involvement is hindering the reunification of the island and stopping, I think, a final and permanent peace settlement. Now, it's an enormous honour, of course, to serve on Labour's front bench in a role that could have such a direct effect on millions of people around the world and the threats of violence that they face every single day, should my party win the next general election. But I think to win the next election, Labour will need to make peace a foreign policy priority as an essential element in that policy. And to do this, I think we need to make the case for conflict resolution and diplomacy over escalatory rhetoric and brinkmanship. Now, peace building should not be allowed to fall by the wayside as the world battles coronavirus. As we know, every day it becomes more and more clear that we simply cannot go back to business as usual after this crisis, where conflicts are allowed to claim the lives of innocent civilians across the world and the proliferation of nuclear and non-nuclear weapons rages on. And I think that if this is allowed to happen, much of the incredible work done by activists like you and so many others around the world will go unnoticed, and the change that we so desperately need simply will not happen. Let me look at the integrated review that the government published last month. Now, we finally heard their long-awaited integrated review into Britain's defence and foreign policy strategy. In that review, the government announced that it'll be increasing the UK's stockpile of nuclear warheads from 180 to 260. Now, this is a move that goes against the well-established status quo. It undermines the UK on the world stage, and it reverses decades of progress on slimming down our nuclear arsenal. I think it beggars belief in the review that the government claims to support multilateral disarmament initiatives in the same breath as announcing an increase in the number of nuclear warheads that the UK intends to hold. A credible minimum nuclear deterrent is one that can already destroy the Earth. The UK alone already has twice the quantity of these abhorrent weapons as supposedly needed. This decision, I think, flies in the face of the UK's historic commitment to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in the year of its 50th anniversary.
Hi, Fabian, can you hear us? Or have we lost you? Could someone else mute and tell me whether that Fabian has frozen?
Yes, yeah.
He has,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah,
So the chances are there's a problem at his end, unfortunately, and he's probably trying to rectify it. Yeah, thanks, David. Oh, this is his way of escaping difficult questions.
So young, so cynical. Could I ask a question while seriously? You sent an email out about whether to get together for celebratory, because we're not going to get together because we're not going to have the fete this year. Has there been any discussion about whether there is going to be a get together, whether you had a word with Denny or whatever?
Well, where we stand, Pete, is that there was generally a very strong consensus in the responses that we got, in that everyone thought it was a good idea to postpone the fete to 2022, but have some sort of other get-together event, probably involving some sort of short walk, followed by some sort of picnic. But the challenge is to have these events so that no one feels separated or ostracized or singled out. You can imagine that, for example, with a picnic, if a family turns up, that's great, or a couple turns up, that's great. But if there's a single person on their own, and we are still self-isolating, for example, then they may feel that a picnic is a little bit divisive, I should say. Denny is consulting with her family to see whether or not they would agree to us using, here we go, I think we're back. Hi, Fabian.
Hi, was that me or I don't know what
Yeah,
happened?
yeah, it
Right.
was your end. Probably your broadband.
Yeah, it's never happened before. We have a very stable connection, but I'm really, really sorry.
Oh, don't worry, don't worry. We were talking about you behind your back when you were.
That's all right, I'm used to that. I'm an MP.
Yeah.
Right, my sincere apologies.
So
I don't know.
the last thing that you said was that it flies in the face of the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Right, yes.
The increase in the nuclear weapons.
Let me start from there again. I do apologize. It's never happened before. It's an essential these days to have a good broadband connection. Anyway, right. So I'll go back to it. Right, this decision, the decision to increase our nuclear arsenal, flies in the face of the UK's historic commitment to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in the year its 50th anniversary review conference. And I think it's just another example of this government saying one thing and doing precisely the opposite. Once again, the British government is out of step with our nuclear-armed allies and has isolated itself on the world stage. In a speech to the Disarmament conference last week, Foreign Minister James Cleverly said, and he's not very clever, "We remain committed to and will actively pursue the long-term goal of a world without nuclear weapons." The difference between the current government and the Labour Party on this is very simple. the Labour Party means it when we say it's incumbent on all nuclear-armed countries to take meaningful steps towards a world free from the threat of nuclear weapons. And we've laid out how we will achieve that. But when the Conservatives claim to say the same thing after this integrated review, it's simply just empty rhetoric. Now, the review was supposed to be the most comprehensive examination of the UK's foreign and defence policy since the Cold War. However, it was extremely disappointing to find that after over a year of development, the review was just full of slogans and almost empty of any detail. Now, it's clear that this government's intent on continuing to fight the Cold War, with increases in our nuclear weapons stockpiles reminiscent of the dark days of the arms race with the Soviet Union. But as you and I well know, the Soviet Union hasn't existed for more than 30 years now. And it's time for the time that the Tories moved on and faced up to the new challenges that this country has both at home and abroad. Not only has the government tarnished our country's reputation amongst our allies, but it's put the entire future of international nuclear non-proliferation at risk. Now, if these proposed increases in nuclear warheads go ahead, our credibility as a slowly but surely disarming nuclear power will be severely diminished. And this will have a profound impact on our ability to negotiate with many of the rogue states who are currently developing nuclear weapons, such as Iran, Saudi Arabia, and North Korea. And I think it's utterly shameful that just months after the first international treaty to outlaw nuclear weapons comes into force, the government has chosen to actually increase our stockpiles. Those who worked so hard to negotiate the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or the TPNW, the first treaty to outlaw the possession of nuclear weapons by any state, should be praised for their significant diplomatic accomplishment. But instead, the government's decided to send a wholly irresponsible message that could realistically trigger a new arms race in some of the most unstable parts of the globe. I strongly believe that the TPNW is the natural successor to the historic Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, drafted in 1968, and which became an article of international law in 1970. And I think it's hugely significant, a development, that the TPNW itself came into force as a pillar of international law on the 22nd of January this year. And it's difficult to stress how important a moment this is in our journey towards a nuclear-free world. But sadly, again, the UK government has failed to engage with it after being lent on by the Trump administration, which explicitly urged all parties to withdraw their support for it. However, with new leadership now in the White House, the UK government should consider how the TPNW can provide a fresh impetus towards multilateral worldwide nuclear disarmament. In the interests of upholding the rules-based order of our globalized world, we must seize the opportunity of the all-important NPT review conference later this year to reinvigorate the multilateral disarmament agenda. The TPNW, as I said, has the potential to work alongside the NPT to encourage non-nuclear armed states not to acquire nuclear weapons for the first time, but will also need more UN-led agreements to further the prospects of a phasing out program for the nuclear armed states, along with a stringent verification initiative. Now, nobody's saying that this treaty is going to get rid of nuclear weapons overnight, but the UK government, like the rest of the world's nuclear armed states, has not been represented at any stage of the TPNW's process into international law. Indeed, in March 2017, when the discussions first started at the UN in New York, I was the only representative of the UK Parliament and government establishment, I'm not part of the government, at that event. All the others were NGOs and bodies outside of government and parliament and statutory organizations. By not participating, I think this has undermined Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which calls for all parties to work towards complete nuclear disarmament. Every decision that is made by every nuclear power should consider whether it's in line with the aims of Article 6. Otherwise, this process will be largely meaningless. But it's now clear that the Conservatives have ditched multilateralism and have recklessly embraced unilateralism to increase the number of nuclear warheads that we have. For more than 50 years, since Britain was one of the founding nations for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, we've had a twin-track nuclear strategy under all governments. First, to maintain the minimum level of nuclear weaponry needed to deter the most extreme threats to our national security, supposedly. Second, to use our position as a nuclear power and one of only 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council to help broker multilateral controls on these appallingly destructive weapons. The government's decision to increase our nuclear capability will undoubtedly have significant consequences for Britain and our allies. It reverses 30 years of all-party non-proliferation policy for the UK, and this so-called integrated review does not even come close to explaining, let alone justifying, this decision. Parliament, the public, and our allies deserve a much fuller account from ministers of the Crown. And at a time when the US and Russia have agreed a new extension to their own arms control regimes, this announcement puts Britain out of step with the much needed fresh focus on multilateralism and decades of progress made by the UK on non-proliferation. Let me turn now to the US-China tensions, because I think these are very relevant to our discussion tonight. Now, it seems obvious that the world's going to face renewed tensions between the United States and China following the coronavirus crisis. And in part, they've already begun. The impact this will have on international political stability in the coming years will be unprecedented, I believe. With China's territorial expansion and the suppression of democracy in Hong Kong, any so-called new Cold War could tragically, easily turn nuclear. Now, we saw signs of this as early as last year, with reports that China had conducted an underground nuclear test, and the Trump administration had reportedly discussed conducting the United States' first nuclear test since 1998. While I'm absolutely confident that the Biden administration will not engage in that type of irresponsible and dangerous brinkmanship, it's important that the US and China take steps right now to prevent these tests, to disarm and commit to a mutual no first use policy. With ongoing issues in Hong Kong and the Chinese government's treatment of the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, the potential for an escalation in tensions and a nuclear confrontation is very real, and we simply cannot afford to take that chance. So any nuclear test has the potential to undo much of the progress that we've seen on arms control over the last 60 years. Now, as a nuclear armed state and a member of the UN Security Council, Britain has a responsibility to prevent both our closest ally in the US resorting to nuclear brinkmanship, but also to be firm with Beijing. But a so-called new Cold War needs ideas of the same caliber that brought about détente in the 1970s and 80s, or 1980s. And it needs to happen much sooner before tensions drag on needlessly through the 2020s and 2030s. I think Britain has to make it clear that nuclear tests conducted by any nation would be a disaster for international peace and stability and for all nations. And any suggestion that brinkmanship would force China, Russia, or any other state into a new arms control treaty is, of course, a complete fallacy. For this reason, I believe that the completion of existing non-proliferation treaties would provide a more immediate solution to preventing such tensions from spiraling into nuclear conflict, particularly those agreements that the UK has already ratified. And I'm thinking of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which was ratified by the last Labour government and, of course, the French government, but has never been ratified by China and the United States. I'm confident, and I've got this from some very good sources, that if the United States finally ratifies the CTBT, then China will follow pretty quickly. The Chinese Communist Party has often made it clear that it will not act alone. But given its considerably smaller nuclear arsenal, it's keen to agree to multilateral agreements with the US and other nuclear armed states. And of course, as we all know, there are huge human consequences to nuclear testing, which are sadly already evident in Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah, where there are now significant cancer clusters following the nuclear fallout from testing of the United States weapons in the past. So if nothing else, the horrific consequences of possessing these weapons for humanity should be the driving force in finally bringing nuclear testing to an end. Now, earlier, I mentioned briefly the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and I'd like to share my views on why I believe it's still so vital today. Last year, the NPT celebrated its 50-year anniversary, and it's without doubt the most important multilateral nuclear treaty in history so far. But there are still some major non-signatories, which the UK could play a part in bringing on board, I think. The most notable are India and Pakistan. With the Kashmir dispute intensifying all the time, this has a real potential to spiral into a nuclear conflict, and indeed on a number of occasions has almost done so. As I mentioned, the NPT Review Conference, which serves to reaffirm states' commitment to the principles of the treaty, has been postponed due to coronavirus, but will hopefully take place before August of this year. And when it goes ahead, I hope to be there in person, flying the flag for Labour to clearly and unequivocally show our support for this vital treaty to our international partners on behalf of the party, our movement, and the United Kingdom, as the British government consistently fails to send any senior representatives to these conferences. I don't think we can afford to waste chances to engage with our allies and states across the world on nuclear non-proliferation, but it's time to learn from others too. The work of the Austrian, Irish, and New Zealand disarmament missions are excellent examples of how to rally support with international partners for the expansion of these treaties, and I'm already working with all of them to develop this relationship from a British perspective. And I should add also that the Scandinavians are pretty good here too, including the Swedes, and as well are the Jamaicans, a very small island nation, as we know, but a nation that's very, very active in pursuing nuclear disarmament. In the same vein, I think we must also look to work with the United States to encourage it to re-engage with the Open Skies Treaty and to negotiate a broader treaty to replace New START when it expires in 5 years' time. Donald Trump withdrew the United States from Open Skies, which allows mutual airborne surveillance of each other's territories to prevent a fear of a buildup of nuclear arms in preparation for a conflict. At the time, the treaty provided a significant amount of much needed trust between the US and Russia. But now Russia has signaled that it will withdraw if the US continues not to engage with it. This agreement isn't the most comprehensive, but it does provide a huge amount of mutual trust. The world has come close to nuclear annihilation by mistake on many occasions. And with such volatile leadership in Moscow, it's really more important than ever that everyone gets round the table to sign back up to this treaty once again. And while the extension of New START for the maximum of 5 years is very welcome, the only way it will mean anything in the long term is if a new treaty is negotiated, which brings in third parties, primarily China. Over the next 5 years, Britain has to use its position on the UN Security Council to ensure this issue is pushed up the agenda with the greatest of urgency, or we risk losing the only agreement that limits the number of nuclear warheads between the US and Russia in 5 years' time. The UN has shown that it's more than capable of filling the void left by New START when it eventually expires, bringing in other countries and playing to its strengths on independent verification and compliance, which commands respect from all the nuclear armed states. From its somewhat surprising support for the Arms Trade Treaty, we know the Chinese government agrees with this analysis too, as it looks to fill the void in leadership left by the US in recent years. Our allies and partners in Asia have also warned that they mustn't be put in a position where they're forced to choose between China and the US, and a reversion back to the spheres of influence we saw between East and Western Europe for decades following the Second World War. The withdrawal of US military from the region would leave South Korea and Japan exposed to China and North Korea's nuclear arsenals and could force their hands in acquiring nuclear weapons in the name of self-defense. I think this is another reason why a new nuclear agreement that includes China is so key to preventing a possible conflict, because the Chinese Communist Party perceives multilateral agreements negotiated by a few powerful nations as hegemonic. Since the beginning of the nuclear arms race, China has opposed allowing decisions about nuclear weapons to be made without the participation of non-nuclear weapon states. and has criticised them as an attempt to consolidate a nuclear monopoly, mainly, of course, on the part of the United States. So in order to bring China into an agreement, it's vital that we look to strike a balance between non-proliferation and inclusivity, without inadvertently ushering in a world where more nuclear weapons are seen to provide security through the dangerous and totally false precedent of mutually assured destruction, or MAD for short. The Chinese government also has a tendency to view international agreements negotiated in the United Nations as more inclusive and equitable, so their outcomes are inevitably more stable and compliance has historically been very good. For example, although it hasn't yet ratified it, China actually had a hand in writing the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which encouraged the then leadership to go further to help negotiate the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty. Now, this treaty would ban the production of uranium and plutonium for use in making nuclear warheads, which the current UK government has committed to promote, together with our international partners. But once again, we haven't seen any action to accompany this government's words. Cutting off the supply and production of uranium and plutonium is so important to preventing the unrestricted spread of nuclear weapons to rogue states, which will get out of control should we allow it to. We've seen the success of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in Iran, which Donald Trump infamously ditched. A similar agreement's now urgently needed for Saudi Arabia, which has worryingly begun its own uranium enrichment program, with no verification from the UN or the Nuclear Suppliers Group, who are responsible for controlling the export of materials used to make nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. This group, again, is supported by the UK, United States, and China, so must now be vocally championed from all sides in order to force Saudi Arabia to halt its dangerous nuclear program. I'd like to end my remarks there, so we can have a discussion about these huge issues for our world. But let me just add this. It may seem like doom and gloom, but with a new, genuinely progressive president in the White House and peace activists like you and so many others, a world free from the threat of nuclear weapons is absolutely possible and completely essential. We've seen from the entry into force of the TPNW that this is achievable. Now, all we need is the political will in the right places. I'm confident by working together across our movement, we will be able to achieve that. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Fabian. We will now have perhaps up to 20 minutes of questions, because obviously what Fabian has given us is an incredibly comprehensive run through an awful lot of topics that I think people will have quite strong views on. To ask a question, if I could ask you just to use the reaction button at the bottom of your screen, or just raise your hand and wave it wildly so that I can actually see that you want to ask a question. If I could just start the ball rolling, if you don't mind. Fabian, obviously, I loved your reaction to the integrated review. I felt that that was actually rock solid, and most of what you said was in keeping with my views. I am a very strong supporter of unilateral disarmament, and always have been. But I also realise that having those views puts me on the fringe of political reality almost, in the sense that it might make me slightly less relevant if I want to be a mainstream politician. So I realise that actually, if you want to make yourself relevant, meaning get yourself voted in, then clearly you have to take some sort of compromise approach, and then you may use words such as multilateralism, even though you're in your heart, you would actually realise that this stuff is a load of nonsense and you are actually a unilateralist. You think we should get rid of these things. Now, I realise that that's where we were perhaps a year ago, 3 years ago, 5 years ago, that you had to apply an element of realpolitik to be relevant. But I genuinely think that we are now in a different world. The survey that was carried out by Survation in January, you may be aware of it, showed, amongst other things, that now 77% of those polled in the UK are supportive of a total ban on all nuclear weapons globally. And that includes 71% of the Conservatives that were polled and 83% of Labour voters. So in other words, you no longer have to play this pretend game of multilateralism, which clearly hasn't worked. You used the word celebrate. We should be celebrating 50 years, but we're celebrating actually doing very little and actually failing in getting rid of nuclear weapons. And if clearly we see now that that this increase that you were quite rightly very strongly against is in a sense the result of multilateralism, if you like. So I was very disappointed at Keir Starmer's reaction to the integrated review, because he came out and said, and I can't remember his exact words, you probably do know what he said, but he basically said that the Labour Party unequivocally continues to support Britain having nuclear weapons. Yeah, and that somehow flies in the face of what I think is this new world that we find ourselves in. So this is your chance, perhaps, Fabian, to admit that you are actually a unilateralist and only pretending to be a multilateralist. Sorry, that's a slightly unfair question, but go ahead.
Well, thank you very much for that very comprehensive response. I've always been a unilateralist. I've been a member of CND for, well, since I was at university, and I'm 66 next week, so that's a long time. But I'm a realist too. And in the 1980s, the Labour Party felt it was very badly burnt, and there was different times, I agree entirely. Very badly burnt by its unilateralist policies. I was part of the disarmament roadshow that we had at the time to try and persuade the public that our unilateralist policies were right. They got blown out of the water, if I can use that term, by the national media. But I think you're absolutely right that things have changed dramatically since then. The Soviet Union has collapsed, and the world is a very different place. And I think the public has gone a lot further than the politicians or the right-wing media. The problem is that even the BBC's agenda is dictated to by what's in the Sun and the Daily Mail. It shouldn't be like that, but it is. And it is so toxic now for the Labour Party or any political party that wants to gain power to say, oh, well, we will just get rid of our nuclear weapons, come what may. I would love to see that happen again. I don't think we're ready for it. Now, going back to what you said about Keir Starmer's response, actually, I wrote part of the speech for John Healey, our Shadow Defence Secretary, on nuclear weapons. And whilst I don't agree with John on what he said, that we must keep these weapons, and Keir Starmer said the same, what John went on to say in the House of Commons in response to the Defence Command paper a week after the integrated review was published, and this didn't get a lot of coverage actually, was that we are multilateralists. We are happy to negotiate the phasing out of our nuclear weapons, provided other countries do the same. So that slightly flies in the face of we will always have nuclear weapons because they're the best way to defend the country. We all know that's not the case. And actually they are a weapon of yesteryear, but sadly and tragically, they have the capacity to destroy the planet several times over and all living things on it, which is why I've always been opposed to these weapons. The question really is, how do we best get rid of them? Now, I know you may think that my speech was too complex and it took in too many different aspects of world politics and superpower politics and so on. But actually, I draw huge encouragement from those negotiations that I witnessed in person at the United Nations in 2017 and then followed through 2018 to the final vote on the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Because if 100 plus states can actually agree that we want to be rid of these weapons, then we change the dynamic, we change the normative view of nuclear weapons. Some of you might be old enough to remember a time when possessing chemical and biological weapons was seen as part of the armory of an advanced and sophisticated power. Those weapons are still possessed by quite a lot of countries, tragically. But if you use them, you are an international criminal. And that may be no use to the people who've been poisoned or murdered through the use of these weapons. I'm thinking obviously of their use in Syria and Iraq. especially Halabja, and of course Assad has used them, we know, against his own population. I'm thinking of the gas, of sarin gas. But he can be indicted as an international war criminal. And I think that we've changed the normative view of those weapons and what they stand for. And I don't think in my lifetime we'll see nuclear weapons or the possession or development of nuclear weapons as being something that is a criminal offense by a state, but it will come. And you're right in what you say, that the public are ahead of us here. So in my party, the Labour Party, and some of you may be members of that party, let's use our democratic processes to make sure that our party's leadership and our Parliamentary Labour Party understand the way our members think. If the majority of our members believe that we should be far more aggressive in negotiating away these weapons, either unilaterally or multilaterally, let the members tell the leadership that that's what they believe, because we ought to respond to the way our members think and what they believe at the moment. And the public, I think, are with us on this, as you rightly say. So we've a long way to go, I think. It doesn't answer the question particularly well, but I will always fight against nuclear weapons. At the moment, I happen to think that the only practical way to do that is, obviously, I've got to obey party policy. It is party policy, and I will follow that party policy, whether it's my personal view or not. But in the end, getting rid of nuclear stockpiles and nuclear weapons worldwide is the only way we can ensure a future for humanity and all living creatures on this planet. And we have a profound duty to do just that.
Thank you, Fabian. I'll let someone else have a go. Dave, I'm seeing your hand. Dave Heady, and then Annette after that.
Right, thanks, Fabian, for your talk. I've got a couple of questions for you, if you don't mind. First one is, where did you find a barber?
Well, I wish I had, but you haven't seen the back of my head, Dave.
Okay. My second question is, I've also, like Stuart, I've read your Wikipedia page, and I apologise that I can't remember whether you are chair of Labour Friends of Israel or just a member.
I've been a member for most of my political life, certainly all my time in Parliament. I've also been a member of Labour Friends of Palestine, and until last April, I was the Shadow Minister for the Middle East and North Africa.
Oh, okay. I don't think Labour Friends of Palestine is mentioned on your Wikipedia page, so maybe somebody ought to edit that.
I can't control my Wikipedia page. I've tried to change it. And every time I change it, somebody changes it back again.
My question relating to that was, I wonder if Labour Friends of Israel has a position on Israel's nuclear weapons, whether you have any discussions like this with Israeli politicians, and if you've got any kind of influence over Israel on that issue.
Thanks for your question, Dave. I mean, I have a very, very mixed feelings about Israel. I think it's a great nation. I've been there on many occasions, and like most British Jews, of which I'm one, I have family and relatives there. But I stare with profound horror at the way the IDF treats the Palestinians. I've obviously spent a lot of time in Palestinian refugee camps, both in the occupied territories and in Lebanon and in Jordan. I'm horrified by the way people are treated, and I think the only answer is a two-state solution, and that window is closing rapidly now. As for whether I have any influence or not, the answer is I don't. I've had discussions on a number of issues with successive leaders of the Israeli Labour Party, which is gradually disappearing, and I think it's tragic that a country like Israel couldn't actually, well, firstly, believes it needs nuclear weapons to defend itself from the perceived threats and the real threats actually from Iran. And secondly, that it believes that those nuclear weapons should not be part of any international treaties or agreements. And if they're going to hold the weapons, at least they could sign up to the NPT, which they haven't done, as we know. And North Korea, are they in the same camp as North Korea, a completely rogue state? And I don't believe they are. So I'm sorry, I wish I had more influence. And just for the record, Dave, actually, we've never had a Jewish chair of Labour Friends of Israel, so I wouldn't be eligible anyway, even if I wanted to. And it's not something I would want to do, because I don't regard Israel as being, right all the time. I am very critical of the Israeli government, especially, and what the Israeli armed forces do. But I think Israelis deserve to live in peace, like every other state. And I want to see more of the friendship that's beginning to develop, or at least the living together that's beginning to develop between Israel and some of its Arab neighbors. There is still a lot of mutual suspicion. But, you know, I went to Jordan a couple of years ago, and I had a long session with the Jordanian military, and they were telling us about the threats to their country, because of course, until recently, they're one of the most stable Arab regimes in the region. And the colonel that I spoke to said, actually, our biggest allies and friends are our brothers, the Israeli Defense Forces. Now, that may tell you something awful about the Jordanian military, or it may tell you that at least there's some genuine friendship there to try and keep themselves mutually safe from one another. It's, as always, Dave, as you know, these are never simple things. It's never black and white. It's always multiple shades of gray. And there are some incredibly strong voices for peace in Israel. Bet Shalom, for example, breaking the silence in Hebron. You know, I've met with and visited many of the villages that are being assisted by Israeli volunteers who are profoundly appalled at the way their fellow citizens who happen to be Palestinian are treated, and are deeply critical of their own state and government, and actually take them to court regularly, including ex-members of the Israeli Defense Forces themselves, the IDF. So, you know, this is there are many nuances here, but, you know, it's not, for me, it's not Israel right or wrong. It's Israel and Palestine being able to live together, and a Palestinian state being essential to the future of the Palestinian people and the Israeli people.
Thanks.
Thank you. Annette, and then Rob.
I found it can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. I found it interesting that you did not mention Jeremy Corbyn. Now, with Jeremy Corbyn, we had a Labour leader who publicly said that he would not be the one to use nuclear weapons as a first strike. The result of that was that it was atrocious the way the media went about that this man is unelectable. And the reason for that is probably his views on nuclear weapons, amongst other things. But the result of that, of the media campaign against him, was that the Tories won. So obviously the majority of people in this country still prefer to have nuclear weapons. So I just simply do not trust those numbers that people give us, that 70 or 80% of the British public would like to be without them. It doesn't make sense. They voted, and they voted for, well, you know who they voted for. So I'm quite worked up about it.
Well, Annette, look, to be fair, you invited me to talk about the prospects for world nuclear disarmament, and that's what I wanted to stick to. I'm very happy to talk about Jeremy Corbyn. He's a friend. He's somebody I worked very closely with. He created this position. And let me tell you that for 18 and a half years, I was on the back benches. I never got the chance to hold government office when we were in power, or office in opposition until 2016 when I was made shadow minister. Jeremy created this job for which I'm profoundly grateful. And I did mention him right at the beginning because he created the position and he appointed me as its first occupant. And I hope that position continues long after I've left Parliament and have retired. And then eventually we get a Minister for Peace and Disarmament in government, preferably at cabinet level, because that's where you get the most influence. Why didn't I mention Jeremy Corbyn? Well, for the very reason I've just said. This wasn't a discussion about him. Was his character assassinated by the right-wing media of this country? Yes, absolutely. And you know, I did a number of talks following the 2019 election about why we lost so badly. And one of the reasons, there's no doubt in my mind, was the consistent and effective character assassination of a man because of his political views, whether they're on nuclear disarmament. As you say, he said he made it very plain he would never, ever sign that letter and authorize the use of our nuclear arsenal. And you know, I was delighted when he said that. But you're right, Annette, also, in that had quite an effect, I think, on the way the public viewed the Labour Party. Now, you'll notice that during Jeremy's tenure of the leadership, we didn't reverse our policy on unilateral nuclear disarmament. In fact, a couple of years, 2.5 years ago, I was hauled over the coals for saying to the Yorkshire Post, that most widely read of national newspapers, not really, I did an interview in which I said that I was a nuclear unilateralist, nuclear weapons unilateralist, and I wished that the party would change its views. And I was hauled in by the leader, Jeremy Corbyn, and the chief whip, and told, if I'm on the front bench, I can't go around saying party policy is wrong, and I'm going to work to change it. So I haven't been able to say that. And that was Jeremy who told me that, because his shadow cabinet were up in arms. Now, Jeremy did lots of really good things, but we have to face the fact that for good reason or bad, and mainly bad in my view, because of the character assassination, because of the way our policies were absolutely destroyed by virtually all the media in this country, we lost that election very badly. It's the worst defeat we've had for years. And we now face, I think, more than one term of this most corrupt, incompetent, right-wing populist government of my lifetime. I'm not blaming Jeremy for that, but I'm saying that's the consequence of what we did under Jeremy's leadership. It's not his fault, I don't think. It's the system we have in this country.
Thank you. By the way, those of you who aren't looking at the chat feed, there's an interesting parallel discussion going on there, which you may also want to dip into. Rob, your turn.
Right. Good evening, Fabian. Very interesting talk, and I agree with a lot of what you say. I'm not sure whether you know who I am, but I'm a former Polaris commander.
Got your book. I've got your book.
Yeah, you've read the book. Good.
I haven't read it. I've got it.
Okay. Well, I would, clearly I would commend it. And from it, you'll find out I too am now, after much thought, a unilateral disarmer. But yes, a pragmatist. The art of the possible is what politics is all about, and we have to find a way forward. I'd like to start just by asking, hopefully, a short question, which I think you might be able to give a short answer to. Having committed the Labour Party, as Keir Starmer did, to the deterrent, the policy for its use, would I be right in saying that the Labour Party will support only first use and sole use, and not the deliberate ambiguity that the present government supports?
Sorry, can you just repeat that, Rob?
Well, the present government policy is one of deliberate ambiguity, which means that everything is ruled in because it's not ruled out, which is actually questionable as whether it's lawful at all. But my question really is, do you support first use and sole use as a party?
We don't support first.
Not support first. No first.
Yeah, I was going to say I was slightly baffled by a question. Yeah, no, we're absolutely opposed to first use. Of course we are. I mean, when I was working closely with Paul Ingram, from BASIC, and you'll probably know the British American security.
Yeah, I work with them.
Yeah, and so I know Paul very well. And one of the things Paul was very keen on was actually having a very clear declared policy that we will never support first use. And I think he's absolutely right. And as far as I'm aware, that is actually our policy. The problem is I've not been on the defence team for more than a year now. I was actually, when Jeremy appointed me, and I haven't made this clear, I was both on the Foreign Office team and the defence team. So, you don't get a job for 18 years, then you get two at the same time, a bit like London buses, I think. Or the way they used to be. So, but I've not been on that team for a while, and I don't know what John Healey's currently developing. So I can't answer for the current leadership, but it certainly was the case when I was on it that we were totally opposed to first use.
Okay. I'm interested because at the end of the month, I'm taking part in an international webinar with the Geneva Centre for Peace Studies and with the PNND. And the theme of that is promoting first use. The other thing I want to look at, though, following on from some of the discussion, is that the government has managed to frighten the country by convincing it that nuclear warfare might be an imminent thing, that we have to be prepared for it at all times. And Trident is a sort of comfort blanket that allows you to sleep peacefully at night. And in fact, the very words nuclear deterrent are part of it, because the word nuclear deterrent implies that it deters. But of course, there is no proof that it does deter. So every time they say it, they're convincing you of its rightness. To me, the only way that I can see is you have to take power away from the elected party. They want nuclear weapons because it gives them international power, but the government in power depends on the electorate for its own power. And if actually the electorate is frightened because the money being spent on Trident is not money being spent on the things that will keep you safe, you might be able to translate the 77% of the Salvation Survey into a more vocal 77% by saying, goodness me, actually, we're being conned. You actually can't use nuclear weapons. It's most unlikely they ever will be used. But we do face some very real threats from China and from Russia and from other states on all forms of asymmetric warfare, which are quite capable of disabling a state without causing a nuclear winter. And that's what people have to understand. So I think there is a national education program needed, which the Labour Party could actually begin to do.
Well, Rob, you might be interested to learn that I'm working closely with the Nuclear Education Trust, who are doing some excellent work on just that, on informing people. The other thought I had was this, that Des Brown, the former Secretary of State for Defence in the Blair and Brown governments in the late 2000s, is, as you know, a convert to unilateral nuclear disarmament as quickly as possible. And one of the reasons for that is that he says a deterrent is only as good as the deterrent ability that it has. In other words, people have to believe that it's either going to be used or that it can be used in the event of an attack. But of course, once that's undermined, it's no longer a deterrent. And in his view, actually, the Russians are either close to or have the ability right now to hack into our control systems. And now you'll know much more about this as a former Polaris commander than I could ever do. But if the Russians and their army of hackers hack into the software and the control systems of these Trident submarines and their missiles and warheads, then they render them completely useless, and therefore they cease to be a deterrent. He thinks we should put far more money into cyber warfare, which has the capability of destroying our way of life much more effectively without actually destroying the planet.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to spend something like 70 billion actually on the Dreadnought class hardware, getting them to sea, not 35 billion as the government says, 70. But that money invested in cyber warfare might provide the defense that we actually need. So I think this education, public education, is badly needed. They don't know the facts.
Well, Rob, it's why I voted on 2 occasions with Jeremy Corbyn against the renewal of Trident and the new Dreadnought class submarines.
Can I ask one more short question, to which I think I probably know the answer to? Do we know why they want 68 more warheads? Because the Dreadnought class, if 2 Dreadnought class submarines go to sea, they can only carry 192 warheads. So what are the other 68 for?
Spares, I suppose. I don't know.
But you don't need 6.
I don't know. You're the expert, I'm not.
No, I think it shows that actually it's just a Boris Johnson puff.
It's flannel.
To be fair to the speaker, as you know, we do let them escape at 9 o'clock.
Yep,
and I'm very conscious of the time here. Bruce, is your question very short? Bruce? Can you hear me, Bruce?
Yep. Yes, I can hear. I was on mute. I've unmuted myself. Okay, I'll restrict it to one question. Thank you very much for your presentation. I was very impressed. It's a little bit off topic, but the last people to sign a nuclear disarmament would be Russia and China. And in the 21st century, we've had astonishingly weak and chaotic government from Europe and the United States. So do you think the recent clampdown on freedom is to prepare us for the coming Sino-Russia empire?
In fact, Bruce, we are asking Fabian to say a little bit about the police bill. So I don't know, would it be appropriate perhaps if we ask Fabian, would you like to give your little police bill presentation now? And then that gives us 10 minutes, the clampdown on freedoms. So or would you like to answer that question?
Well, I mean, it's hard for me to answer the question. I sincerely hope there isn't that conflict coming up. I mean, look, we've been quite successful, reasonably successful in the world since the Second World War in trying to stop conflagrations, especially superpower conflagrations. We need to work a lot harder. I hope that the bill before Parliament will be defeated. I think there are quite a few Conservatives who are opposed to it. But let me, I'm sorry, Bruce, I can't answer your question clearly, but let me just give this very short presentation, and then we can perhaps discuss that in the light of all the other issues we're discussing. Would that be okay, Chair? Yeah,
definitely. Go for it.
Well, you've asked me to address the bill, the Police Crime and Sentencing and Courts Bill. Actually, I was in London on Saturday and inadvertently walked into the middle of the demonstration, which was very heavily policed, but I'm glad to say there was no violence there. As I'm sure you all know, the Labour Party voted against the bill, and we will continue to vote against it. I think the tragic and appalling death of Sarah Everard has instigated a national demand for action to tackle violence against women. And the last thing the government should be doing is rushing through this poorly thought out measure to impose disproportionate controls on free expression and the right to protest. Now, I think now is the time to put in place long overdue protections for women against unacceptable violence, including action against domestic homicides, rape and street harassment, as well as tackling misogynistic attitudes that underpin the abuse that many women face every day. But instead, the Conservatives have brought forward a bill that's seeking to divide the country. And it's a mess, frankly, which could lead to harsher penalties for damaging a statue, up to 10 years in prison, than for raping a woman, minimum term 5 years imprisonment. And so this divisive bill severely limits free expression and the right to protest, which is what the peace movement is founded on and how we make our voice heard. As a democratic society, I think we must stand up for the right to peaceful protest whenever and wherever it's challenged. And, you know, though I just wanted to say those few words. I'm very happy to listen to your thoughts and hear the discussion. I think I've probably spoken a little too much. So let me just throw it open. I mean, we are opposed to this bill. The priorities are entirely wrong. And there is the danger, as Bruce said, and I'm sure many of you believe, and certainly the people on the streets of London and Leeds this last weekend believed, that we are facing a clampdown on the right to protest, the right to free speech, the right to actually demonstrate, and you know, the idea that damaging property and damaging the statues of slave owners from the 18th and 19th centuries is actually a greater offence than the violation of another person, whether male or female, is frankly distorted and warped. I'll leave it there, Chair.
Thank you. So we throw the floor open again for questions, and this can now be on either the police bill or on the nuclear disarmament, or Fabian has also given us permission to ask any question on any topic, including cycling and the building of carbon fibre bicycles. So just raise your hand if you would like to ask a question.
Oh, I can't be that good.
Francis.
Oh, Francis.
Followed by Jenny.
Hi, thank you. It was something that came up when you said that when Labour gets back into government, you have a roadmap, in a sense, for getting out of nuclear. And we've been having some great talks in recent times about the big tie between military spending and civil nuclear, as a sort of this illusion that it might be good for for the environment, and also some people were saying about how much waste there is from nuclear. And I'm just wondering already that we don't know what to do with. So when you say a roadmap, what sort of I mean, and I think, and also somebody else said about how things that could also be used instead of this deterrent argument, which is difficult to argue. There's a lot of environmental points that could be won, even starting now. So what sort of roadmap, what would we do if that started to happen?
Well, Francis, I don't think we haven't worked out a detailed policy yet, but firstly, I think we've got a framework of international law, this international rules-based system, which we need to strictly adhere to. But you know, one of the things that occurs to me, which I've learned throughout my time in this position, is that actually the best way we can secure the future of the human race and of this planet, there are two things we need to address. One is the man-made destruction, the human-made destruction of our natural world and environment. And you've only to watch David Attenborough's programs to see that, how effectively he puts the case for much, much harder work and collaboration worldwide. It should be the top of every politician's agenda. But the second thing that occurs to me, and that I've learned these last few years, if I didn't know it already, was that the biggest driver of human insecurity is inequality. And I mean inequality of resources, of education, of respect, of financial resources. Just look at where wealth is concentrated and where poverty is concentrated throughout human society. And if that isn't a driver of insecurity, I don't know what is. So if we're going to address insecurity of our nation states, first we have to address the profound inequality between nations themselves, between the genders in most of the countries of the world, between the resources and the way they're used or misused. So I don't have a roadmap yet. We won't have a comprehensive roadmap. But what we will do is adhere to the international rules-based system of international law, which as defined by the treaties that we have ratified ourselves and that other nations in the world have ratified. I hope that's helpful, Francis.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jenny Chesterton.
Right, thank you. I'm not a member of the Labour Party, but I am convinced that in order to get where we want to get, which I think we all agreed is unilateral nuclear disarmament, that we need the Labour Party and we need a Labour government. My first question is a simple one. Is there going to be a Labour Party conference this year in spite of COVID and all the rest of it?
I don't think that's been decided yet, Jenny, but it's going to have to be decided in the next 2 or 3 weeks because you need at least 5 months to actually organise it.
Yes.
I don't think we've decided yet.
No, well, I thought I hadn't heard of that there was going to be one. But anyway, at the next Labour Party conference, whenever that is, surely we who believe in nuclear disarmament need to get this onto the conference agenda.
Yeah.
And it needs to be voted at conference and become Labour Party policy. And then when it comes to the election, people can go all out and say, this is what we want. This is what we've got to campaign for, and get the Labour Party behind it. The question is, how do we get there? How do we convince, or how do we urge Labour Party members?
Sorry, Jenny, if you speak down, then we can hear you. If you're speaking up, we can't hear you. Could you just repeat the last couple of sentences, but speak down to your keyboard?
Okay, is that better?
Yeah, that's good.
So I think the question is, how do we influence Labour Party members or to bring this up at conference and get a proper peace and disarmament policy on the agenda for the next election?
Thanks, Jenny. You know, we work through our constituencies and branches and our affiliated organisations, as you're probably aware. So I know perhaps we don't all believe in resolutionary socialism, as we used to call it, but actually passing resolutions through branches, through constituencies, through trade union branches and affiliated bodies to the Labour Party does have an effect. And putting forward resolutions for party conference debate through that structure will ensure that those debates are heard on the floor of the conference. It hasn't yet, although it's in very serious danger of becoming so, simply a rally for the leadership. It isn't that yet, and it is still has the last remaining vestiges of a decision-making democratic forum. We've got to make sure it stays like that. But we're in serious danger of it becoming much more Americanized, where you simply rally to the cry of let's beat the other party. That's not the kind of politics I want. We need to be very serious and consider very carefully how we're going to tackle these things, and frankly, find the allies that we need. You're not going to believe this, but there are one or two in the Tory party that actually believe that having nuclear weapons and increasing our stockpile is a bad idea, not least because it takes away money from conventional weapons and conventional armed forces. If not nurses, doctors, highways, railways, public transport, health and education. And there are enlightened Conservative MPs, as well as all the other parties, that believe that. Let's find our allies where we can and have a broad alliance against the evil that is nuclear weapons. But we need to do that collectively, and we need to spread the word, which I know you're all trying to do every day.
Thank you.
Do we have any hands raised? Pete? Pete?
Good evening. I am a member of the Labour Party and have been for 50 years.
Excellent.
Can I forget somebody has to be. Can I forget the logistics of getting into power and all the rest of it? But what actually would happen on day 2 of a Labour government, or any government for that matter, what would actually happen to this country if on day 2 we said, right, we're scrapping nuclear weapons, whatever we've got, the dreadnoughts, the submarines, decommissioning. I know that you can't do that overnight, but we actually scrap it. We're going to go unilateralist, to hell with the rest, like well over 100 other governments and countries in the world.
Pete, it strikes me you've seen that 1980s series, A Very British Coup, which is one of my favourite TV series. And you'll remember there the Sheffield Council Estate born Prime Minister, Labour Prime Minister, virtually on day 2 of a Labour government, surprise victory, starts in public setting about dismantling our nuclear arsenal. What would happen? Well, we'd get rid of our nuclear weapons. Pretty simple, isn't it? They would go, and frankly, nobody noticed, I don't think, because we hold what, less than 2%, Rob, of the world's nuclear weapon stockpiles. It would make no difference whatsoever to anybody. We wouldn't suddenly be open to attack. We wouldn't suddenly be invaded. I don't think anybody would notice, although, of course, the Daily Mail and the Sun would go completely bananas. So the answer is, yeah, of course we could do it, Pete. Of course we could. We need political will. And I think we can show by example. We need some really brave political will here to say, we'll take the bull by the horns. We will deal with this. Because actually the country's needs, the environment's needs, are far, far greater than this nonsensical idea that we should be wedded to a 20th century weapon, which even then was pretty useless and is even more useless now, fighting the wars of the last century.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Fabian, can I just follow with a question on the same subject, really, that what you've just said in the last couple of sentences are absolutely huge, wonderful, positive ideas that really could inspire people to follow the Labour Party with such charismatic views. So the question really is, surely what you've just said in the last few sentences would be a much more wholesome strategy for political success than to say we unequivocally support nuclear weapons and the UK having these nuclear weapons. Surely this must now be a huge opportunity for the Labour Party to embrace what we're thinking is a new norm.
Well, you know, I have to be quite careful. I'm a representative of the Parliamentary Labour Party, of the front bench, of the Shadow Foreign Office team. I'm part of a team. We work collectively. We don't work individually, and our strength is in our collective organization. But I've always believed that sometimes you've got to be courageous in what you do. And I'm not criticizing Jeremy Corbyn or Keir Starmer. I think they're both great leaders. And I think Keir Starmer could well be the next Labour Prime Minister, and I hope he is. And I will work very hard for that. But sometimes you need the spark of an idea. A few years ago, I was very privileged, before I was on the front bench, to be the co-author of a document which nobody's ever read, but which laid out a blueprint for publicly funded social housing along the lines of the Dutch and many other advanced European countries, where you use pension funds to co-finance with taxpayers' money social housing that is of the highest possible quality, but most importantly of all, actually is built along the passive housing model that the Germans have developed, which means you build houses that actually use 10% of the energy requirements of most modern housing today, and especially this old 18th, early 19th century house I'm sitting in at the moment. And in doing that, at a stroke, you provide the most fundamental basic need for all our citizens, which is affordable housing. And at the same time, you also provide the answer to the soaring energy costs and the percentage of disposable income that most people have to spend on their accommodation and associated utility bills. And of course, you're also stopping carbon outputs and climate changing gases being emitted too. So, and of course you create a lot of employment. So sometimes you've got to actually be a visionary here and put out an idea that people might poo-poo and find reasons why you can't do it. But you've got to be able to persuade people that these are the reasons that you can do these things. Because I have this belief that some of the people in this country voted for Brexit because they were so disillusioned with the way they were treated, and they believed the European Union was responsible, I think totally mistakenly, for their daily lives, their daily struggles, and the fact they just couldn't make ends meet, working all the hours they possibly could to put food on the table, feed the families, and keep themselves warm and dry. And it is that bitterness and resentment that is being harvested by malign forces in this country that are turning it in on itself and forcing people to blame the other, the foreigners, the black people, women, whatever it may be, it doesn't matter. But what we've got to do, I think, is find a way of redressing the balance of inequality in this country and with it the rest of the world. And I think a lot of that, not all of it, drives the wars, the conflicts, the disputes, the anger that people face all over human society in whatever country. It won't be done overnight, but it can be done. And it needn't cost a fortune. It's just a way of harnessing our resources and using them more effectively. The Scandinavians have shown us this. Many of you will have read that book, The Spirit Level. It's a few years old now, but one of its co-authors was Jennifer Pickett from York. I'm a graduate of York, and I did economics there as well. So, it can be done. You've got to have the will to do it. And one of the problems successive Labour leaders have shown in the past, one of the issues is naturally and understandably their fear of opprobrium from the largely right-wing dominated media owned by so few people who've got no interest or investment in this country or its people. And we've got to tackle that too. So I'm not saying I'd ever want to be leader of the Labour Party, because I certainly wouldn't. But actually, we've got to sometimes be courageous, even if that does cost us. I think Jeremy tried to do that and it failed. I think Keir could well do that and it could succeed. He's got that kind of forensic mind. He's a really excellent leader. So let's take the bull by the horns and say, these are the problems of this country. These are the problems of our planet and of humanity. Let's tackle them together as one. It's idealistic, but in politics, unless you have ideals, you have nothing.
Thank you. We have time for just one more question, and Helen, you are going to close the proceedings for us. Go ahead.
Yes, yeah, I was just wondering, you've mentioned the role of the media a couple of times. I was wondering how you suggest that ordinary people can actually get a more balanced view because of the role of the mainstream media and the very biased presentation that it gives on virtually all matters, particularly in relation to politics and nuclear disarmament. How do ordinary people get a more balanced view, and how do the people who don't have time to read a whole range of sources, how do you actually balance that out?
Helen, that's really difficult, and I think successive Labour governments have certainly tried to cope with and deal with that issue of media bias, which has always been present. It's why Tony Blair, whatever you think of it, tried to make friends with Murdoch. It didn't succeed ultimately, but it was kind of going down the right track. What he should have done actually was start looking at the ownership and have laws in place or develop and pass legislation that restricted the right of individuals who are not resident in this country and therefore have no stake in the UK to own huge swathes of the media across radio, television, and the print media. Actually, while social media can be a very bad thing because it can be just an echo chamber for people who are like-minded, it's also a very good way of democratizing the media, because anybody's opinion is as good as anybody else's opinion, and you can find out almost anything you like from the World Wide Web and through Facebook or all the other different, Twitter. I don't do Twitter myself, but although I have a Twitter account that somebody else runs, I can't stand it. But there are so many ways now of getting your opinion across, and even the Times, bless it, allowed me to write a red box piece, which is their kind of opinion editorial piece. It wasn't about nuclear weapons actually, but you can actually express yourself these days online and find those opinions and views. And you don't have to listen to the Daily Mail or the Sun, but you'd be amazed at how popular those websites are. In fact, I think the Mail's website is now more popular than its newspaper. So God help us all, frankly.
God help us all. Fabian, do you really want to finish on that final sentence?
No, no, you're right. That's a very good point. I'm not a great believer, I'm afraid. So sorry to those of you who are. But I do think we don't need God's help or any outside forces' help. We can do it ourselves. The power of collective organization, as I've learned all these years in politics, is absolutely massive. If we set our minds collectively to do something, whether it's saving the planet or ridding ourselves of these shocking and appalling destructive weapons, we can do it. But we've got to have the will, and we've got to work hard, and we've got to persuade the generations coming after us that this is the right way to go. But not individualism, collectivism. That's the way forward for us, for human society. So together, we can and will succeed in eradicating the scourge of nuclear weapons from our planet, and of actually addressing inequality, which is such a big driver of conflict. We can do it. So let's set our minds to working harder to achieve that.
Well, Fabian, on that note, I think that's a very positive way of rounding things off. And I really do want to, on behalf of everyone, express our gratitude to what was a very rich and inspiring and also thought-provoking series of presentations. And the way that you answered the questions was also incredibly honest. So really, from all of us, we would encourage you to inspire your colleagues to take these opportunities and the bull by the horns, because you've said it yourself. Yes, we can think of reasons to be positive, and that things can change for the better. We're all allowed to go off mute, and we're all allowed to just make some noise or clap our hands in appreciation.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thanks ever so much, Fabian. Thanks again. We really appreciate you giving us your time.
A pleasure. Thank you for your time, and thank you for sharing it so wonderfully. Thank you to all of you. I hope to see you again soon, one day, very soon.
Okay.
Bye for now. Keep up the good work.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
You.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Nice man.
Are you determined to stay till last, Jenny?
Yes, why not? Go on.
Right, I'm ending the meeting. Bye.
Yeah, go on.
Bye.
Cheerio.
Bye.